Heyo, APUSH students, chapter 24, Industry Comes of Age, 1865 to 1900. This chapter is going to address a lot of things. So firstly, it's going to talk about the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the influence of railroads on the country. One of the important effects, aside from linking the nation together, is that it's going to lead to the first large corporations in America and the first of what we call captains of industry, which is the name given to industrialists who become exceedingly wealthy and contribute to the building of America. We will learn about several of these people, like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, as well as the tactics they use to build their businesses and consolidate their power over their respective industries. Because they get so big, they're going to employ a lot of people and have a lot of factories. So this emerging industrial class of workers is going to challenge the conditions of their employment through the formation of labor unions and are going to fight for better working conditions. This is going to lead to some substantial labor struggles and conflicts that you will need to know about. Beyond this, however, this chapter gives us some insight into some of the more modern perceptions we have about the rich versus poor, what should be done to help the poor, what role government should play in regulating businesses. All that stuff had its start here in American history, and understanding that will help us understand why we talk about things in the way we do today. So let's get started. Earlier in this class, we talked about the importance of canals in the market revolution and the integration of economies. Well, these economies are now integrated, and America is a country that spans the entire continent. It has the shape that we now know today for the continental U.S. Starting in the 1840s and going on until the 1900s, this is going to be a time of the railroad construction, and it's going to explode during this time. In 1865, there were 35,000 miles of railways, and by 1900, there are going to be 192,000 miles of railways. Much of that is going to be west of the Mississippi River. So the idea of a transcontinental railroad is something that captured the imagination of a lot of people in the country. There was no one single railway that went across the entire country. There was a huge integrated system of rails on the West Coast and the East Coast, but there was no one line that linked the two together. And so that was the goal. And it had to be able to go through the Rocky Mountains. So this is going to be achieved by the federal government taking the helm and providing the funding and also what's called land grants. A land grant is basically when the government takes control of an area of land and then hands it over to a private company for the purpose of building the railroad. So without that government intervention, no one company is going to be able to successfully buy that land and afford being able to build that railroad. So how much land did the government appropriate and then hand over to these companies? Well, if you take the entire area from all that right-of-way that was acquired and the land grants that were acquired for the building of transcontinental railroads, and you lump it all together, it's about equal to the size of Texas. So this is a huge, huge amount of land you're going to see. And I'll show you in the next slide, I'll show you what that looks like. Two corporations, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads, are given the commission of building the Transcontinental Railroad. It was meant to link Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. The Union Pacific would work from Omaha to the west, and Central Pacific would start from Sacramento and go east. And over these years, the Union Pacific lays 1,086 miles of track, and the Central Pacific lays about 689 miles of track. Keep in mind, the Central Pacific had to go through the Rocky Mountains, and that was no small task. Sometimes they only made it inches a day trying to blast through these mountains. One of the things mentioned in the last chapter was how Chinese workers were integral in helping build the railroad, and it's by being employed through the Central Pacific Railroad that Chinese workers are going to be crucial in helping build the Transcontinental Railroad. So since a fixed meeting point had not been set, railroad crews actually started going past each other because they were being paid by the number of miles of track they laid. So as they were blasting through mountains, sometimes the debris from one crew would fall onto another because they were working so closely together. So finally, in 1869, the federal government intervened and picked Promontory Summit near Ogden, Utah, as the place where the railroads would be joined. And at a ceremony in 1869, a golden spike was driven into the rail, which completed the Transcontinental Railroad. It was seen as a unifying moment in American history, and there were celebrations all over the entire country as a really important feat. Maybe you have family members who watched the moon landing in 1969. And so you can kind of think about it that way, as something that people thought was impossible, but now it was becoming a reality. So the nation was now truly joined together through a transportation network. And by 1884, there are going to be 4 other transcontinental railroad lines that are going to be completed. This is the first one. When we say transcontinental railroad, we're talking about the one completed in 1869, this one being the first. Like I was saying, there's the map of land grants that were taken by the federal government and then given over to the railroads for railroad construction. You can see the route of the Transcontinental Railroad going from Nebraska over to California. There is a picture of the celebration ceremony, the two railroads being joined together. It's hard to stay still in these old photos, so I don't know how they did it. You saw this in an activity we did in class, just reintroducing you to the idea that urbanization is a big deal around this time, and the population of cities is going to grow significantly, largely because America is experiencing a shift from rural production and agricultural production to more industrial production, and the growth of factories is going to attract workers to cities. Again, corporations become really important around this time, and they're going to grow substantially. This chart shows the wholesale price of goods as well as GDP. GDP is basically an economic measure of all the wealth a country has. During this time in American history, prices of goods go down because of efficiency in production and the emergence of more factories. And the country as a whole, and the people as a whole, do get more money. What we're going to see, however, is that the lives of industrial workers are going to be very poor, and the wealth in the country is going to be concentrated into the hands of a small number of factory owners and wealthy industrialists. Again, looking at the specialization of the economy and the integration of companies together, all of these companies eventually get owned by Andrew Carnegie and his United Steel Corporation. Or I think it's Carnegie Steel is the name of the corporation. Again, iron and steel production increasing during this time, and cities are going to be able to grow up instead of just out, as you have multi-storied buildings that can sustain that weight load. As you saw from the charts in the previous slides, business and industry is growing in the United States at an enormous rate. During this time, we're going to see the emergence of business leaders who are going to rise to the top of their industries. They employ a number of ways to try to circumvent competition and gain advantage over production in their respective industries. A few of the people you're going to learn about are Andrew Carnegie, who became leader in steel production, John D. Rockefeller, whose business Standard Oil was one of the largest companies in the country, and J. Pierpont Morgan, whose company J.P. Morgan is still a leader in finance today. It's important to know the difference between horizontal and vertical integration and how they were used. Vertical integration is when you buy all the different organizations that are part of different phases of manufacturing your end product. This will make your production more efficient. So let's just say, for example, you make automobiles. If you were to vertically integrate your automobile company, you would buy rubber companies, steel companies, cloth companies for the seats, glass companies for the windshields, sand companies to help make the glass for the windshields. So you're buying different aspects of production in order to make everything cost less and be more efficient and profitable for you. Horizontal integration is when you just buy the same company in order to take them over and remove them as competitors. So with this example, if you're a car company, you would just go and buy the other car companies. These tactics are employed by these leaders of industry during this time to become more wealthy and have more control. Other ways to remove competition might be having a trust, which is basically when smaller companies are actually working for a larger company, even though they are technically a separate company. So for Standard Oil, you had the leaders of different companies, but actually they all had stock in Standard Oil and took orders from Standard Oil. So that's, they're really not independently run. They are kind of in the fold of the larger company. So one of the things that we value in American society is that the best ideas should win, or that competition is what drives the marketplace. So if this is starting to look like that goes against that idea, you are correct. These titans of industry weren't really interested in being fair in their competition with other groups. They were, downright ruthless in a lot of ways. They wanted their own businesses in their respective industries to grow, and they're going to undertake some pretty, ruthless methods in order to achieve these goals. This is why going forward, you're going to see responses to this in the form of labor unions, and increasingly a call for government to impose some regulations against what are deemed unfair business practices and to break up monopolies. However, it's important to remember that during this time, the government was very hands-off in these businesses, and this allowed them to become enormously wealthy and kind of run things the way they wanted to. But we are going to see, they are prone to abuse in that way, and that does lead to a call for more government response. just a chart showing horizontal versus vertical integration and how it works. You can see vertical integration on the right-hand side, buying different parts, production, transportation, processing, versus horizontal integration. Let's say I'm a transportation company and I just buy all the transportation companies out there. One of the things we're going to talk about in later chapters is that this growing industrialization leads to an increasing number of people shifting their work from rural and agricultural work to industrial work. More people are going to be living in cities, and they are going to be experiencing some very poor living and working conditions that are going to create a number of problems. This will bring some criticisms on the industrialists, and the accusation is that they are getting wealthy and living this life of luxury without really considering their workers or treating their workers well, basically just getting rich off of the toil and destruction of the working class. And so there are a number of theories and ideas that are going to be devised to explain how to address those issues. We're going to talk about socialism and communism in a couple of slides, but those are responses to industrialization. Think about how workers are being treated and how socialism and communism, which we're going to define in a couple of slides, can be seen as responses to how to address that situation. I'm going to talk about a couple of different ones that are a little more specific to American society. And so the first one is Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. What he's saying is that it's the responsibility of the rich and wealthy to help improve society. So people who get rich, have an obligation to help the society that helped get them rich, basically. But he wants them to spend their money in a very specific way. He doesn't believe in direct relief for the poor, but he does believe in providing people or the public with opportunities to improve themselves by giving them educational opportunities, libraries, concert halls, public gardens, things like that, so people can access them and improve their lives. So that's why you have Carnegie Hall in New York City and Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. So it's estimated that Carnegie really does, commit himself to this idea and tries to encourage other super wealthy people to do this as well. And by the end of his life, he spends about 90% of his overall personal fortune on philanthropic pursuits. He also left no money to his kids because he wanted them to work hard like he did and make something of themselves. I'm sure they were really grateful for that. So the people who defended capitalism, and specifically kind of unregulated capitalism during this time, had the belief that people who had achieved this amount of wealth, that these people were the fittest in society and the most talented, and that they had done it, all themselves. Granted, there are like a lot of different factors that go into somebody making a fortune of this type. Carnegie and Rockefeller, for example, they were kind of born at the right time when oil and steel were becoming new industries. So that there's also something to be said about that as well. Regardless of this, another defense of this kind of unregulated capitalism comes out in the form of social Darwinism. And so they take this defense of capitalism, they combine it with evolutionary ideas of Charles Darwin to form this ideology known as social Darwinism. It basically says, the idea of survival of the fittest. I'm sure you've heard that before. It takes that idea in the wild that only the strongest, animals, organisms survive, and then applies it to, human society and people. So according to a social Darwinist, the wealthy are wealthy because they are better people and naturally more talented and capable, and poor people are poor because they have some inherent defect or they're just morally bad people. So, take that idea about, if a social Darwinist is asked, what do you do about people who are homeless or people who are unemployed? A social Darwinist would say that government or individuals should do nothing to help that person because eventually that person will die and then society will be stronger because that person will be gone. So, getting rid of those weak people will then make society stronger from a social Darwinian standpoint. It's also worth noting that the term survival of the fittest was never in any of Darwin's works. He never actually said that. This phrase was adopted and co-opted by social Darwinists who attempted to justify their theory by taking scientific ideas. I'm doing air quotes in case you can't see. They took ideas that are technically scientific and they made this kind of a link to how it should make us function as a society. So obviously we're going to talk about this in class, subject to a little bit of criticism. But just so you know, Gospel of Wealth, social Darwinism, ideas at the time that tried to explain, why poor people are poor and what obligation do people have to help those people. Okay. As I said in earlier slides, the government doesn't take a whole lot of interventionist measures in the economy to try to rein in business and regulate them. The only significant piece of legislation aimed at regulating businesses during this time is the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Its intent was to limit the control of businesses from forming trusts and to try to stop any business from getting too large. But it was full of so many legal loopholes and lacked enforcement power that more trusts actually formed during this time than before. And it's not really until the early 1900s this bill is going to be revised. There's going to be more vigorous prosecution and breakup of trusts by the federal government. We're not there yet. But just so you know, responses from government related to regulating businesses is going to be very, very minimal during this time period. We're looking at the Gilded Age. Industrialization is going to cause a lot of people to move to factories to work. This does create economic opportunities for women, but during this time, it's not so much as a way for women to become more independent as much as it becomes an economic necessity that all members of the family will work in factories. The price of housing is kind of out of control, and there's not a lot of regulation there. So you have, people, every member of the family has to work, sometimes including children, because there really aren't compulsory education laws, and there really aren't a lot of strict laws concerning child labor. So you have young children working in factories and other places as well. Because of production of new materials in factories and because of the availability of more producible goods, the industrial elites are going to have opportunities to show off their wealth in ways they had not before. By 1900, 10% of the people in America owned 90% of the nation's wealth. America had transitioned from being a nation of farmers into a nation of wage earners. And in 1860, half of all the workers were self-employed, but by 1900, 2 out of every 3 working Americans depended on a wage or being paid by someone else. So seeing this transition happening in a very rapid time in American history, it's just important to kind of recognize and note that. Industrial production was efficient because you had interchangeable parts and you broke each step down into small steps that were really easy to operate. This made it so that you didn't have to really train your workforce very much, and a lot of these jobs are going to be de-skilled, meaning that things that previously required skill and knowledge and education to be able to do are now broken down into small steps that then you just need to train someone how to operate a machine and to do a number of repetitive motions. So because you don't have to train your workforce very much, and since America was experiencing so much immigration and population growth, there was a huge availability of laborers. You could fire and replace workers easily, and you could also pay them very little because if they didn't like it, they could just quit, or you would fire them and then you could just hire somebody else. And basically, wages were really, really low for industrial workers because there weren't a lot of options out there for work for these industrial workers, and there was a huge surplus of labor at the time. If there was a slowdown in production or workers couldn't perform their tasks, they could also lay people off. Workplace accidents were very common, as well as deaths in the workplace because of being unsafe work environments. There were no safety requirements for these factories. Employees individually there was very little they could do to challenge the system because they could easily be replaced and they had no legal foundation to challenge their employment. So this is going to lead to the emergence of labor unions, where workers try to band together to petition for better wages, better working conditions, holidays, things like that. Employers, they didn't like labor unions because that would interfere with their ability to run their factory the way they wanted to. And, they are going to discourage unionization through a lot of different means. And it's important to know what are some corporate tactics that they're going to try to employ to attain these goals. So I listed a couple here that I'm going to explain and talk about just to give you a little background on this time period. So an injunction is when the government steps in and forces workers to return to work. And we're going to see that, when the federal government intervenes in labor strikes, they're usually going to intervene on the side of the employers because of violence breaking out outside the factory, and they're going to force workers to return to work and break their strike. Strike breakers is when an employer just hires other workers to replace the striking workers. And when workers are refusing to work because they're on strike and they have demands they want the employer to meet, they just hire other workers. Sometimes they're derisively called scabs by the strikers because they're seen as a negative impact on what they're trying to achieve with their strike. So if you're a factory owner, one tactic that employers would often use would be to hire black workers or foreign workers, because that would then lead to race-based violence between these groups. So by exploiting racist attitudes, employers could break a strike and impact the ability of workers to collectively unite. A lockout was when a factory owner would lock the factory and not let workers in until they stopped trying to unionize. And a blacklist was something that you could get your name on it if you tried to unionize or cause trouble with your boss. And that basically meant that no one else would ever hire you again. So we're going to talk about tactics that labor would use in a minute, but I wanted to introduce you to some of these terms. And the next slide, we're going to talk about political ideologies that were becoming more widespread in this time period. Okay, so before I talk about this, I want you to think about the conditions that are being created by industrial work. The fact that many of these workers are poor, their labor is being exploited in the factory. Trying to get better wages and better working conditions through unionizing is one way to try to get them to improve their lives. But there are also political ideologies that are emerging during this time that are seen as more long-term solutions to the bigger problem of worker exploitation and a government that doesn't really intervene. So many of the revolutions in Europe during the 1800s had aspects of these ideas in them. And of course, communism is formulated by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, two German philosophers, in 1848. So it's right around this time period. These ideas are current. They're being discussed in cities all over the world. Increasing amounts of literacy and means that these ideas are printed and distributed. And a lot of these cities have their own newspapers, not only in English, but in foreign languages like German. There's a lot of German workers in Chicago especially. So you're going to see these ideas being circulated, discussed all the time. And I just want to give you a very, very basic introduction to these ideas, and we can talk about them more in class. So socialism is defined as the collective control of the means of production. This takes a lot of different forms. So one of the most common is when the government takes control over certain industries or the means of production. Means of production just means the ability to produce something. So basically ownership over the factory, right? So going back to the last chapter, when the populists were calling for government ownership over railroads and the telegraph, that could be considered a form of socialism. Socialism kind of gets a bad name today, or it's used in a negative way. When those people are talking about socialism, they are talking about socialist governments in the Soviet Union that were oppressive to their people, or communist governments like Cuba and North Korea. So it's important to note that socialism isn't inherently evil or bad, or really inherently good. It's just when that control becomes oppressive or taking away people's rights that it can be misused. Other examples of socialist countries today include Scandinavian countries like Finland and Sweden and Norway, where for the most part, education and healthcare are free to all people. Of course they pay higher taxes, but that's another example of socialism as it can be applied through government control. This can also be collective control, can be worker cooperatives. That means that the workers themselves own the factory instead of a factory owner who pulls in a larger salary than the average industrial worker. So that's an idea on how to make the system more just for the workers, right? So communism, also another idea being thrown around. Communism is an extension of socialism that was theorized by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, like I mentioned. Now, they believed the workers would get so frustrated with their exploitation that they would take control over the means of production, which is considered socialism, but then it would evolve into a society where there were no social classes, no government, and collective control of all property. Their reasoning was that people wouldn't need government to protect private property since private property wouldn't exist. And people wouldn't naturally want to exploit each other, and so these people would cooperate with one another in order to build a society. The Communist Manifesto, if you've ever read it, it is very vague about what the future is going to look like. And it's seen, if it sounds really idealistic, that's because it is. The idea that there'll be no social classes, that means no division in society, and all people will cooperate. That is a very much kind of a utopian ideal. Nevertheless, people felt that could be a way to make society, more humane for all, right? And then anarchism is another idea, which is saying that government should be abolished and society should be organized on a voluntary, cooperative basis. It's important to note that there are so many different subsets and offshoots of socialism, communism, and anarchism, and proponents of these ideas would argue and debate them all the time. They're still arguing about them to this day. Question for you. Is violence acceptable in achieving these goals? Some groups thought yes, some groups thought no. Do you achieve change through legislative means by getting people elected and participating in the democratic system, or do you just forge your own society outside of the system? Groups disagreed on this as well. So I'm telling you about these ideas, first of all, so that you can be informed historians about what these ideas mean in their original form, and also to get you thinking about what life might have been like in industrial cities during this time. There were a lot of ideas circulating and a lot of different groups of people advocating for different solutions to the problems they saw in society. And it is these ideologies that are going to have a direct impact on the development of labor unions in America. Before the Civil War, there were a couple of unions, but they were related only to certain crafts, such as bricklayer, typesetter, shoemaker, etc. After the Civil War, a lot of this work is de-skilled, and industrial production is going to replace some of these industries. So more and more people become industrial workers who earn a lower wage. The cost of living increased after the Civil War, which put a lot of financial hardships on these industrial workers. So the first national labor union is going to form in 1866, which aims to unify workers across all locales and trades so they could then challenge the employers effectively. So now if you have unionized workers all over a city or in a number of cities, they have union dues that they pay. Those dues could be used to sustain workers who are in a strike or pay for legal counsel. So the emphasis becomes getting all workers to unionize together into larger organizations to effectively challenge their employers. The National Labor Union only lasts 6 years, but they gained 600,000 members during this time. They called for things like an 8-hour workday and arbitration in industrial disputes. Arbitration is one of the labor tactics to try to gain more rights for the workers, which is the idea of sitting down with the employers and having a third party try to mediate the dispute between the two. Most often, the role of that third party to arbitrate would be assumed by the federal government. Another more extreme tactic was the strike, which is when workers would refuse to work at a factory until their demands are met by the employer. The employer is going to lose money because they're not going to be making anything, and the workers are going to be not making any money either. So you can see why having a national labor union was the goal, because labor unions would have a larger strike fund to help out those workers to sustain that strike, and then hopefully get the employers to give in to some of the union demands. Early labor unions are going to debate whether or not striking is appropriate to do. Some labor unions advocate for arbitration only, while others are open to using the strike. We're going to talk about some notable labor protests in this time period and the two really important national labor unions that are going to emerge in the late 1800s. The National Labor Union declined in part because of the Panic of 1873, and a new organization called the Knights of Labor is going to take over. And it's going to take a lot of its members. Three, two, one. The National Labor Union declined in part because of the Panic of 1873, and a new organization called the Knights of Labor is going to take a lot of its members and become a nationwide labor organization. They began in 1869 as a secret society, and their goal was to include a lot of workers into one large union. They accepted skilled and unskilled workers, men and women, and black and white workers. This was seen as progressive at the time, although they had separate meeting halls for white and black workers, and they were very outspoken in their opposition to Chinese labor. So it was somewhat limited by our standards today. In addition to the 8-hour workday, which is their big goal, they were socialist in nature by calling for cooperative production, an end to child labor, and a graduated income tax. Terence Powderly, pictured here, is going to lead the Knights of Labor during its most productive time, which is going to be the 1870s and the 1880s. The Haymarket Riot stands out as one of the most violent incidents in the labor movement, and it tells us a lot about what was going on in cities during this time. In May of 1886, there was a strike at the McCormick Reaper factory in Chicago, Illinois, so a factory that produced mechanical reapers that farmers would use. This was at a time when the Knights of Labor had 80,000 members in Chicago, and they were participating in strikes for an 8-hour workday. On May 3rd, the police fired on striking workers, and a young German anarchist and newspaper editor named August Spies witnessed this and went back to his newspaper press and published a call for a meeting on May 4th in Haymarket Square to discuss what had happened. and talk about actions that the group should take. He wasn't a member of the Knights of Labor, and actually the Knights of Labor didn't organize the strike because they believed in arbitration. But some members of the Knights of Labor were working at the McCormick Reaper plant, and some were involved in the strike. And so there's a lot of different labor activists and labor groups that are in Chicago at this time. Anyway, these workers gather at Haymarket Square on May 4th, 1886. And they are speaking about the violence that happened on the 3rd and how they want to achieve their goals and what the response should be. At some point, the police try to break up this assembly, and while they're doing this, somebody threw a dynamite bomb at the police. It exploded, and in the ensuing fighting, at least 8 people were killed, most of them police. After the bombing, a wave of hysteria swept through Chicago, and anarchist groups were blamed for the bombing. Ultimately, 8 anarchists were arrested, not because they had any direct evidence in throwing the bomb at Haymarket Square, but because they advocated for anarchist ideals, such as overthrowing a government violently. And the courts basically said that, their ideas had inspired others to be violent, and therefore they are just as guilty. If this sounds a little ridiculous, that's because it was. A number of people were charged who were not even at Haymarket Square at the time of the bombing, and one of the members of the jury was related to one of the police officers who had been killed. So you get the sense this isn't really going to be a fair trial. At the end of this trial, 5 of the anarchists were sentenced to death, and 4 were ultimately executed. 3 were given a life sentence, and they were later pardoned by the governor of Illinois, who came out and said that their prosecution and imprisonment had been politically motivated and was done out of hysteria against anarchists at the time. The governor who pardoned them is going to face death threats, and someone actually sent a bomb to his house because of his pardoning of these anarchists. But it's seen now as we talk about Red Scares in American history. There's the McCarthy Red Scare that most people know about in the 1950s, where America is trying to find communists and they're getting on blacklists. There's a Red Scare right after World War I where some government officials, they do get bomb threats, and a lot of Russian nationals and communists are going to be rounded up and deported from America. That's in like 1920. But this is also seen as one of the Red Scares in American history, and kind of the first one, where there was this wave of anti-communist or anti-anarchist, or basically, any foreign ideas. There's a lot of hysteria, and sometimes people are unjustly, prosecuted and convicted and executed for an idea. And this is one incident where that happened pretty notably. So the ultimate impact of this bombing is that it led to a decrease in the Knights of Labor's membership. Even though none of the anarchists were members of the Knights of Labor, the fact that the Knights had more progressive socialist ideas made them a scapegoat for this violence. And they were tied to the violence at Haymarket Square, which led to a decline in their numbers. So the first real effort to organize international labor unions is going to ultimately be unsuccessful, and other groups are going to come up that are going to replace the Knights of Labor as prominent labor organizations. So you do need to know the Knights of Labor, when they were prominent, who they accepted, what they did, and we're going to need to know this other one as well. Here is a picture of the Haymarket Square bombing as it was shown in Harper's Weekly magazine, which is kind of the most widely read magazine at the time across the country. Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions you can make about what's going on in that scene, and we'll certainly talk about it in class as well. In 1886, the same year of the Haymarket Square bombing, the American Federation of Labor was founded. The leader of the American Federation of Labor, named Samuel Gompers, was a former cigar maker, and he's going to lead the union for most of his life. They are going to differ from the Knights of Labor in a number of ways. First of all, they are a federation of different national unions, which meant there was no national organization like the Knights of Labor had. Each union had the support of each other and kind of did their own thing, and you could join local chapters based on where you worked. They accepted skilled laborers only and worked to protect skilled labor jobs like, cigar making, machinist, plumber, something like that. They also accepted only men and advocated for what they called pure and simple unionism. So you're not going to see any efforts at cooperative ownership like in the Knights of Labor. The AFL advocated for things like better wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. So they're going to be a little bit more of a pragmatic and rational alternative to the Knights of Labor, which was seen as a little too idealistic. So keep these labor unions in mind and bring me your questions as we go forward in this class, because you're going to learn about other labor organizations and other labor strikes that are going to be happening at this time in American history. Oh, and one of the things they pushed for was a closed shop, which is basically when you join a job, you are required to join a union, and that would make the union stronger and give them more funds to support the efforts of striking. They also believed in strikes, which was something that made them different from the Knights of Labor and maybe strengthened their numbers a little bit more. Here is the timeline. Thanks for listening.